So I'm John Dales and I run a little company called Movement. We are transport planners and we design streets. And actually I would probably take issue with Christian just at the outset there that Jonathan Prince probably quite right actually about the housing transport thing. Housing is fundamentally incredibly important. Of course transport is, but there's always a danger with transport. We think people who do transport who think it's the end of the world, and actually it's not. And that's why I begin with the photograph here talking about transport, which is just a couple of people who I paid no money to walk beautifully up the middle of Camden High Street. Because actually transport needs to be able to facilitate this, a city that we actually really want to be in, as opposed to just move efficiently about. There's a bus in the distance there, of course, which is great. Because fundamentally, which is something that the people like me are not very good at doing, is that transport is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, and yet people who deal with transport often think of it in that sort of way. So long as I sorted out a junction to my satisfaction in terms of playing some models so the traffic works, it's okay, and I'll walk away, and you're left with a bunch of guard railing and 3 green men to cross and stuff like that. And the end of London's transport is a greater London. We need to really be sure when we're thinking about transport that we're working back from that. And although an efficient transport system is incredibly important, we can obsess about that to the detriment of the goal. Here's a quote from Fiorello LaGuardia. I've got a few sort of mayoral quotes chucked in here, but there's an interesting one that he said, obviously former mayor of New York, which is, there is an extent to which congestion, all that stuff that we ideally would like to somehow get away, different types of congestion, is a badge of honour for a city. I tell you, there are many towns that I've worked in over the years that would beg for some of the congestion, simply because it means that people want to come here. It's an active city. You look around some streets and it wouldn't be nice when. Actually, but cities are so dynamic, so lively, there's so much going on, there'll always be that. You know, it's like this here, right? If there were loads of empty seats, that would be really nice and comfortable for the rest of us. It's great to have standing room. Okay, that's a mark of success, and we need to bear that in mind. I don't know if you've ever read this book, Strap Hanger. It's a really good one by a chap called Taras Gresko. And the point he is basically making is that he's trying to promote the use of mass transit in cities and saying how important it is we get our heads around this. The idea that what he's saying is, look, I'm writing this book because this was a mistaken idea. Because what has happened when we've designed our cities, as we so often have around the needs of motor cars, that they've made them horrible places to live. Now, interestingly, the former Labour mayor of London commissioned this report here, and you can hardly see it, which is a very bad front cover, so I'm trying to... It was called Towards a Fine City for People. 10 years ago, you can see that now, and that's really how we should be considering transport, in the context of how do we get a fine city for people. The current mayor has started something like that with the idea of the roads task force, but of course it should be the streets task force in the first place, and that's why they've tried to hack streets, which is, let us think about what more we want our highways to do for us than just move traffic. That is not a bad thing, and it is starting to infect thinking in transport for London, which should have been infected in these sorts of ways 10, 15, 20 years, and frankly from the beginning. So it's quite helpful that that sort of thing is getting into people who are the ideas that we need to be thinking of streets as more than just conduits for transport. Is getting into some thinking which is good and something that should be pushed. Here's a contentious thing that I put before, but I think this is when we're thinking that for people like me in the transport industry, especially the highways industry, this is something we should bear in mind, because actually we should never have really roads, just streets. Which is to say, all our highways, we should be looking for them, almost all of them, not all of them perhaps, to be doing a lot more than just shifting tin from A to B. There's a world of difference between a street and a road, and transport people are very bad at understanding that. In fact, they're great at understanding that. Transport people, when they go on holiday somewhere, they know what a good street is and they love it. Then they come back, sit at their transport desk and build roads. So we do have to watch for that. Now, in terms of the roads task force, it's come up with this idea. We used to grade, you don't need to get in the detail of this, but you can download some of the stuff on the roads task force. There was a report this last March, which is quite a good summary, just about 20 pages. Anybody can read it. Quite a useful document to read. And what it's suggesting is we should try and classify every highway we've got in terms of not just what does it shift, but what kind of place do we want it to be like. And actually what I like about this actually, although it's from the Roads Task Force, there's only 2 of these 9 categories they call roads. And in fact, even the things they call high roads are probably streets in many respects. In other words, there's still a lot more than just moving traffic, even though there's a lot of moving traffic going on them. So one of the things as we're looking to the future and ideas for transport in London is to do what George Santayana encouraged us to do, is let's just look where we made some blunders before and let's try not to do them again. And there is a danger that we're going to do that in my profession, in terms of some politicians as well, because somehow we think, all right, maybe we just didn't build enough flyovers and tunnels and stuff back in the 60s, so we'll just do some more of that. But it's just going to be completely chasing our tail here. And obviously somebody with whom Christian has complete sympathy here, Stephen Norris, even, I would say, he got this some little while ago, and actually, in terms of how he sees urban transport, he's actually quite savvy, I think, not bound by sort of party affiliation in this respect, which is, come on, it didn't work. So why are we thinking about trying to road build our way out? Here's a wonderful diagram you might be interested in. This is essentially, you don't have to worry about it, but look at the black line is kind of how traffic has grown, and all the things that keep going up the street is how modelers, traffic modelers looking ahead, have convinced ourselves that it will grow. It doesn't happen, partly because it can't. But we always still look at these things when we do some strategic traffic forecasts and assume the worst. And it kind of never happens, and partly because it can't, possibly partly because we don't want it to. One of the things I'm concerned about with what's in the thinking of transport for London at the moment, and this sort of is, it's not a direct quote that comes out of the Roads Task Force work, this idea that, look, we're going to build all this stuff, do all these great schemes, Crossrail 2 and more, and still, based on these predictions, we're going to have 60% more congestion in 2031. And yeah, simple answer, isn't it? You know, it won't. It won't, and it won't because it can't. It's not because you won't sit in that queue and neither will somebody else. Certainly not if we do something else. Other things will happen. It always has been that way. And the thing for us is not to just assume, look, those graphs never did work out, is how do we make those graphs not work out? What, again, this idea of what do we want to put into that, not just be led by the nose. As I say, we don't want those things to happen, or as Joe Strummer said, the future is unwritten. You know, and there is a danger in transport planning generally. We will look at some predictions, and we should predict, but then be led by the nose by them rather than seek to influence them. And we should seek to influence on the basis of this question. And this is where I come back to this point about what transport is and it isn't. Transport's not a means in itself. We have to consider transport in the context of this question. You know, do we want London to become like this? You know, it does
Come
look...
on, big resounding no.
Yeah, it is. Well, the thing is, some do. That is LA, in fact. And it does look, you know, like it's been photoshopped, or like The Judge from the great, you know, urban planning movie, Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You know, the judge there, you know, he loved this idea. There's this golden future that somehow, if we just had lots of big roads, all would be fantastic, and it would work. We don't have the judge, but we do have Lord Wolfson of Aspley Guys here, who seems to have some amazing ability. Basically, the more roads we build, the richer we'll all get. That worked, didn't it? And yeah, he's saying this stuff. You know, his wife's an advisor to Osborne. He's an influencer. He runs Next. All right. And this idea, and you think, but amazing. One of the things I love about Wilson, he actually said, and this must have sent a cold shiver of terror down the spines of everybody who lives in Westminster. If we built all these flyovers, people from Croydon could be in Westminster in 12 minutes. He ain't ever going to work in that town again. And besides, he's well out of date because he's talking about flyovers, whereas we all know it's all about fly-unders now, which is just a clever way of just rebranding a tunnel, which is this idea of what we might do in Hammersmith. And I suppose this is very, very convincing if we don't think about it too much, which is, you know, that horrible flyover, we don't like it, all that nasty traffic, we'll just stick it underground and all will be well. But where does it end? Does that traffic just go faster to Earl's Court? And so we end up with more of a problem there that we'll have to fix in the same sort of way. Where it sort of ends are in proposals like this. Now, one of the things, this idea you may have heard about, this interorbital tunnel, is this simple idea, which is it comes from a plausible and reasonable source, which is if you want these streets to be what we want, if we are working back from, what kind of street do you want? But then we don't believe much in this idea of getting rid of that 60% congestion. Well, it'll have to go somewhere, won't it? If you want the streets at the ground level to be nice, and let's agree that we do, well, we'll just have to put all the traffic underground. Really? So in terms of thoughts about this, it's interesting that the interorbital tunnel, you know, it's absolutely like that. The whole thing, frankly, is a bunch of fingers in the air. We've seen this figure for that. I just want to consider what will that do, okay? The current price of Crossrail 2 is alleged to be 12 billion. Well, maybe it will be, maybe it won't, but it's got the same as, it's as reliable, probably, actually more reliable than, so perhaps we'll have Crossrail 3 then, and we could have another Crossrail 3.5. And so for the price of it, we could have 2.5 more Crossrails. You know, there we are. Thank you very much. That's a much better way, in my view, to spend, frankly, I don't know where all those Crossrails will go. We'll be near the centre of the earth at the end of that time. But this idea of there are other ways of doing this thing. You know, Crossrail 2, we should just roll straight on, in my view, absolutely straight on from Crossrail 1. Let's just, you know, just turn the, I don't know, do the tunnel diggers just turn right from where they are at the moment? I don't know, just keep boring.
I think they bury them.
Keep boring. Right? Just some other thoughts about the challenges we face. This photograph I took just a year or so ago, just a random photograph, and I looked back at it afterwards, the easy thing, which is easy for me to say, look, we can just get rid of all this traffic and so forth. Look at that, look how white it is. This is just a flyover going into, on the A40, just coming over the Edgware Road. That stuff is not almost very little, thanks to the congestion charge, very little traffic, road traffic in central London at the moment is optional. At the moment, and a lot of the cars you might see are either taxis or minicabs. It's white vans, it's deliveries, it's stuff that we aren't travelling in ourselves, but it's travel that we generate by wanting a lettuce on a shelf or wanting a plumber to arrive at our door. So these are real challenges. So how are we going to deal with that? Even if we can get rid of all that personal transport into buses, bikes, walking, trains and so forth. And even if we do get a lot more transit into buses, this is the kind of thing we encounter, a photograph of Oxford Street. So again, this is a real challenge. It's not easily done. Can we just simplistic ideas that we'll just shove everyone in buses? That is not a challenge that is just all good. You know, how do we work that one out? How do we manage? Because these buses, notwithstanding what a lot of people choose to say sometimes, are often really full of people going from A to B. So how do we manage that? Boris never really chose to manage it. He just used a very colourful way of expressing the problem. I look back, I couldn't find Zen anymore, so I'm glad I nicked him at the time. Ken, prior to Boris, actually had a much better idea. Although you'll see, the actual way of making the buses fly was by having more conductors, and we've gone from that, of course, completely. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. We have sort of semiconductors, as I like to call them. Thank you very much. I'm here till Thursday. On the Route Masters. But actually, perhaps all that kind of ticketless stuff that we have at the moment, or almost all of us will have an Oyster, is a great thing. But it's a challenge. How do we deal with that? Here's another challenge, going back to this issue of freight. You've seen that advert, I'm sure. I just can't help but think this is what it should say. You know, it's just a fact, isn't it? That's not, to be honest, that's not having a go at the freight industry. They're entirely entitled to do what they're entirely entitled to do. But we should consider, if that's the situation, you can't have 12 bikes in a blind spot, that vehicle's unfit, what are we going to do about that? Now, you can't just say to the freight industry, go and sort it out. There has to be some matter of how do we help them sort it out as city planners, as city authorities. Here's a thought from another mayor. This is the former mayor of Bogota in Colombia. Just a way of thinking about it, and going back to that previous one, which is, do we just accept that actually, well, I need Tesco's to get my food in there? Or do we think of it this way, which is actually those people, and they could be kids on trike, should be able to be there. We'd never let them on a road like that with a lorry like that around, would we? So just to sort of close, really, some thoughts about the kind of things and these other sticks that we need. And all of these, to be honest, and I'm always slightly nervous about brand new ideas, great thoughts. You know, because actually a lot of it is about, we know what to do, we should just be more convinced on doing it. We should have street pricing, which is, you know, just my way of saying congestion charging. We do need that. We should have more of that. We just need to learn as a city that we can't travel around as freely as we might want to by car, because if we could do it, just us, that would be fine, wouldn't it? But of course everybody else has to if we can, so we need to work out how that works. And I think having workplace parking levy is a bit of a technical term, but basically means if you can drive and have a free parking space at your office because your office happens to have a bunch of parking spaces, we need to have some mechanism of actually taxing that so it is not free. There is a scheme in Nottingham. They're not very popular at all with business. You can understand that. But again, that's part of trying to engage business in what is the best for your city. What do your people want to come to work? What kind of city do your employees want to live in? And then the third one about time, size and emission restrictions is we will have to think of some way of dealing with the freight challenge. Okay? Boris has spoken about that. It's very easy to speak about it. It's very hard to work out what you will actually do. How do you break loads down to small vehicles, to small electric vehicles? Who starts to get that ball rolling in terms of innovation and support in terms of grants? So here's what you might do in terms of carrots. And I think the key thing is this idea of options. Cities are, the genius of cities is that there is so much you can do. Okay, but we have to facilitate the other things. So in other words, that 60% growth in congestion will not happen because there are, and we will have to give transport, as it were, options. You know, you can't just say, well, you are going to. That's why you go to places like Bangkok and maybe other cities like that, where it's just huge traffic queues, because actually people have to travel from A to B, and that's kind of the best option they've got. We need to give them better options. So they could be more Crossrails, a better public realm. Others will talk about that after me, which is basically say, so it's much easier, much more attractive to walk places you don't at the moment, that you think, I won't do that, I'll jump in the car or I'll get on the bus. Better cycling provision, better investment in buses and trams, and that includes buses and tram technology, but other types of technology. Driverless cars have been out there recently. And supportive infrastructure investment, that I'm specifically thinking there about what can London as a city do to support the freight industry, which we all need in a variety of different ways, however locally we normally try to source, the vast majority of us don't. What kind of infrastructure can the city support to make that work? Just quickly on the technology front, these guys were in the news a lot this week, and I do fear that they're going to be, that actually specifically, things like this Google car is the future of taxis. That's hard. That's hard, but actually it might apply to any technological area. You know, private cars as driverless cars, I'm not sure, because we like to drive, people like to drive who do like to drive. But actually just those simple journeys, this thing whistles up and it goes, that could be a much more efficient way for London of dealing with taxis. That's a long way in the distance, and actually something that a mayor could only have some aspect. But it's just add a dimension of how transport must, will, should change in terms of London. So to finish, there's a danger, nevertheless, of thinking that technology will solve it. If we all drive Priuses or Leafs or things, it'll all be well. But again, going back to Taras Kresge, was saying, look, you could have the most beautiful, clean car, but unfortunately, cars are disastrous for cities in terms of mass transit. We have to enable people to work and move stuff in much cleverer ways than small private vehicles. The current mayor of Bogota, although it keeps changing because he keeps getting basically kind of fired for his past, which in Bogota you can imagine what kind of past that might have been. He just puts this out there, and that is, as it were, I suppose, the heart where Strathhanger is coming from. As a city, we've got to get over ourselves, and as Londoners, we've got to get over ourselves in terms of how we travel. If we give them great public transport, give us great public transport, we'll do that. So I'll finish with no mayor, but John Ruskin, who said this, and this is, again, the context for me in which we should try and think about all these things with transport. We want London to be fabulous. Thank you.